The annual Global Climate Conference gets underway in Azerbaijan.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must invest today to save tomorrow.
Hanging overhead, the U.S. presidential election.
It is clear that the next administration will try to take a U-turn and reverse much of this progress.
And we'll talk about what is hoped for and what's expected from this year's COP29.
What I have hoped at every single one of the COPs is that there's going to be meaningful binding agreements around emissions reduction. Today
is Monday, November 11th, and this is The Issue from VOA. I'm Scott Walterman. Lori is off today.
It gives me great pleasure to declare open the 29th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
The annual United Nations Climate Conference got underway Monday. Nations gathering to talk about changing climate change.
COP29 is a moment of truth for the Paris Agreement. It will test our commitment to the multilateral climate system. We must now demonstrate that we are prepared to meet the goals we have set ourselves.
That's Azerbaijan's Mukhtar Babayev, who is serving as COP29's president. The top agenda item, a deal for up to $1 trillion in annual climate finance for developing countries. We're placing a target of $100 billion. That's money from wealthy countries to poor countries to pay for climate damage. The Global South, Africa, for instance, is getting hit hardest by climate change, but has contributed the least to it. UN Climate Chief Simon Steele.
So let's dispense with the idea that climate finance is charity. An ambitious new climate finance goal is entirely in the self-interest of every single nation, including the largest and the wealthiest.
All right, so let's just review, apologies if you already know this, some climate change basics. So certain gases in the atmosphere absorb energy. That slows or prevents the loss of heat into space. Those gases are known as greenhouse gases. They act like a blanket, making the Earth warmer than it would be otherwise. The baseline used to measure the change is the time on Earth before industrialization, before factories, before gas-burning cars, and so on. The target was not to let it get warmer than 1.5 degrees centigrade than it was before industrialization. But we've already passed that change for now. How much warmer it's going to get, well, we don't know. It depends on what we do between now and then. And that's what these meetings are all about. And here to help us understand more is Professor Meg Mills-Novoa at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for being able to do this today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So this is the 29th. This is COP29. They've been doing this now for 29 years. Have we really come that far in the 29 years they've been meeting?
Oh, well, I guess that's about our expectations. I think the COPs have routinely brought attention to climate change on an annual basis. You see it in the headlines. You see global leaders making promises. If they follow through on them is another question. But the COP has served the purpose of making sure that this remains on the global agenda. That being said, of course, in terms of real emissions reductions, we've underperformed on almost every metric. So in that sense, the COP hasn't brought necessarily the sweeping decarbonization efforts that we had hoped for 29 years ago. And I think, and this is on everyone's mind, but the recent election is going to be sort of looming large at this COP. In Trump's first administration, he withdrew us from the Paris Agreement, which was, the most important achievement of the COP meetings. And Biden reentered us into the Paris Agreement. Trump has vowed to take us out. And so I think for the global community at COP, it's a whiplash effect and really a question of where do we go from here? And for a lot of states, where we go from here is that they're making decisions that they're going to take leadership roles. States within the United States were still in coalition during the first Trump administration. I expect for that to also appear in future COPs. And the Biden administration is going to be doing everything they can during this last COP to really, say that they're going to follow through on their commitments that they've made. They're going to try to, enshrine the Inflation Reduction Act's achievements in, to the extent that they can. So this is really going to be the tenor of the COP this year.
Yeah, the U.S. envoy addressed it straight up first thing. We anticipate that he's going to follow through on everything that he said he's going to do. And don't mistake that for the climate change efforts in the United States to be dead. But the reality is the Inflation Reduction Act is the kind of thing that has, would you say, or would you agree, some people say that it's that kind of legislation that is going to have the most effect moving forward on changing the climate?
I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was a monumental and incredibly important policy vehicle for delivering decarbonization in the United States, which is a top greenhouse gas emitter, both historically and also currently, with China being the top, but us really, we're a major emitter and we set a global agenda. And so I think the IRA is incredibly important for understanding America's decarbonization. It will continue to be important, but also it's at risk of being repealed, or parts of it could be repealed. And so I think we're at a real moment of uncertainty. Those types of policy vehicles are important. And many of us in the climate movement saw the IRA as the beginning. and I still feel like it's the beginning. This is going to be, year by year, decade by decade, this is going to be us ratcheting up our ambition, which has always been the hope of COP, that as these meetings progress, so would ambition among partners. And so, I think we're just in a moment of uncertainty.
There is a certain amount of momentum toward decarbonization that no government can stop. People want to buy electric cars. Even aside from the environmental benefit, they're simply cheaper to operate. So over time, these things sort of have a life of their own, do they not?
Absolutely. I think to say that, the only decarbonization that's going to happen is going to come as a direct result of the Inflation Reduction Act or any sort of government measure, I think that's overblown. We do see, the price case changing drastically for across renewables. We see that for EVs. We see these things becoming cheaper. We see the public acceptance going up. I think the thing that's missing is that having federal support around decarbonization can really make sure that this isn't just happening for the wealthy first, our early adopters, our folks who can afford the EV, but was actually opening up inroads for less wealthy individuals and communities to be able to also benefit from decarbonization, to be able to afford some of the large capital expenditures necessary. That's going to be harder. It's, being able to build out our EV network across the United States instead of relying on a single company like Tesla building their own chargers. We were going to be using federal dollars to build that, more broadly. And so I think some of those questions of equity and accessibility are some of the risk of us letting the private sector drive this. But absolutely, decarbonization is happening. I think its pace and its equity implications are things that, we would like to see the federal government make play more of a role in.
If the U.S., as expected, backs away from this kind of thing, other countries, China notably, big player in renewable globally, does the United States get left behind? Do other countries take the lead and reap those economic benefits?
Well, I think, there's many countries across the world who are taking decarbonization seriously, who are moving forward on this, and also others who are laggards and are not. I think the reality of the climate crisis is, we share an atmosphere. And so, obviously, there's been a lot of efforts to try to make sure that we have some of the renewable manufacturing, we have some of those economic benefits onshore to the United States. We're not just importing all of our EVs and our solar panels abroad. So there's been efforts to make sure that the U.S. is being able to benefit from some of those types of manufacturing bumps. But, for me, as someone who's just deeply concerned about, the changing climate, I want decarbonization everywhere for everyone. And I want it to happen as quickly as possible, because that is the reality of the climate crisis, is that we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So if others internationally are going to take a leading role in the short term, I celebrate that, and I hope that they do. And then I hope that we can use that as a lesson here in the United States about the kind of agenda and the types of political coalitions that we need to also achieve decarbonization at speed and scale. So, I don't necessarily see it as the U.S. pitted against other countries in this battle. I see us all in a frantic fight to really decarbonize our economy to save this planet.
We've passed the point where 1.5 degrees is attainable. And there are people that say at some point in time, the trend will reverse later, maybe now than it was a month ago. Is there any modeling on where we really wind up, do you think?
Well, our current trajectory is looking at about 3 degrees of warming by 2100. So that we're blowing past our sort of safe operating space of 1.5 degree warming or 2 degree warming, which has always been sort of the thresholds that have been used at the Conference of Parties as our global targets. And so we're certainly not on track for that. I think this is still a story being written about what we can do. I think, as you mentioned, we're most likely going to overshoot 1.5, and to achieve 2, it's going to really require a massive drawdown of our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think kind of where we're heading right now is not where we need to be heading. And really, we're trying to figure out how we can really kind of ratchet up the decarbonization. Of course, there's always these ideas that we're going to overshoot, and then we'll be able to draw down our carbon dioxide through, direct carbon capture or through other forms of intervention. So, I think there certainly are models that are coming out that are thinking through this, and there are also kind of efforts to really be able to think through different scenarios by which we overshoot, by we come down, what would be the role of the different technologies, and what's required on the policy side to deliver those technologies. So that's certainly going on, but yeah, it's not looking great right now.
We saw a taste of what's to come this past year. I think North Carolina is a great example. A part of the country got hit by a hurricane that doesn't get hit by hurricanes. And you can see the way we've built our society up till now, building in the floodplain because the land is good and farming is rich. Those kind of things. At some point in time, people are going to see we're really spending a lot of money to fix the places we've built rather than address the climate issue. At some point in time, that's going to be a tipping point where people realize that, no?
You would hope so. We're seeing this, every hurricane season seems to be more intense, right? This year was unprecedented across many, on many characteristics, and also it's not over yet. So, at what point does the cost of adaptation, does the cost of disaster recovery, how does that sort of tip the balance into understanding, wow, it's far less expensive than decarbonization? I should say on the science side, we've known for a long time that decarbonization was always going to be orders of magnitude less expensive than adaptation. But I think that's very different than people feeling this and this hitting the ground in real ways that affect people's lives. I think, unfortunately, in the United States, climate change has become so politicized that even in the wake of these large disasters, we're not necessarily seeing a lot of, state lawmakers really taking up and really framing what's going on in the context of climate change and in the context of the necessity of decarbonization. But, maybe we will hit a threshold or that will happen. I'm not sure.
Back to COP. What do you hope to see from COP this year? What do you think is possible, and what do you hope is possible?
Well, what I think is possible is it's going to be just essentially a lot of conversations about what comes next in the next 4 years. What is it going to look like? in the context of a Trump presidency to continue on in COP. And the U.S. isn't, obviously, we're just one of a whole host of nations that gathers for the COP. But the U.S. does play a really important role in setting the agenda. We played a really important role in pushing for the Paris Agreement. So I think there is going to be a question of what are the coalitions that are going to be required to really advance, who's going to take on a leadership committee or a leadership role. If not the United States, is China going to take on that mantle? Are other emerging economies? Is the EU? Who's going to be really kind of leading and pushing forward in the COP space in the absence of really any meaningful U.S. presence? I think it'll also be one, I think so. I think what's possible is that there will be sort of conversations and planning about what comes next and what decarbonization is already baked in and what we can generate as a global community. In terms of what I hope, what I have hoped at every single one of the COPs is that there's going to be meaningful binding agreements around emissions reduction. I unfortunately don't think we're going to get there. It's been really challenging to have binding commitments. But that's, of course, always been my hope and the hope of others. I am the adaptation side, which is where I work more. I am always hoping that the COP is a space for historical greenhouse gas emitters to make meaningful pledges around, really providing funds for adaptation and loss and damage in the global south, which is just getting absolutely hammered by climate impacts right now and has contributed so little to the climate crisis. So I'm always hoping for those sort of big money pledges. We'll see what comes out of this COP.
Hey, thanks so much for the time and the insight.
Thank you, Scott.
Professor Meg Mills-Novoa at the University of California Berkeley, where she is director for the Climate Futures Lab. This has been The Issue from the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thank you so much for joining us. Follow The Issue on X and Facebook at VOA The Issue. And for news 24/7, go to our website, voanews.com. In Washington, I'm Scott Walterman.